The mystery of lead masks. Based on real stories. The small electronics laboratory where Manuel and Miguel worked always had a peculiar smell of burning solder and melted wires. But that night, there was something different in the air. An uncomfortable silence, an invisible weight that made the atmosphere suffocating. Manuel, always skeptical, felt an unexpected chill while soldering a radio part. Miguel, at his side, was restless, moving his fingers on the table as if a strange energy was taking over him. Over the past few days, they had become involved with a select group of men interested in unusual scientific experiments. But there was something wrong. The conversations were increasingly enigmatic, full of words that seemed chosen to hide a forbidden secret. When they received a message in an envelope with no return address, with detailed instructions about a mysterious meeting, Manuel hesitated. Miguel, however, seemed fascinated. The letter said, "The time approaches. Knowledge will be revealed. Bring protection and be prepared." Protection? Ready for what? The two friends spent the night debating, but deep down they knew they were already too involved to back down. The call was irresistible. Days later, something made them make a final decision. A man, tall and with angular features, appeared at the store where they bought equipment. He didn't buy anything, he didn't talk to anyone, just watched them. His eyes, hidden behind dark glasses, seemed to pierce his skin, digging into his thoughts. When he left, a note was found on the counter. "You have been chosen. Fate awaits at the top." Miguel convinced Manuel that it was not a coincidence. They needed to move on, go to Morro do Vintem and find out what awaited them. What's the worst that could happen? To die? Miguel's laugh sounded dry and uncomfortable in the silence of the workshop. That night, Manuel dreamed of a storm. In the midst of it, he found himself in a deserted place, the wind howling in his ears like evil whispers. Something moved in the fog, a faceless figure. And then he realized he was wearing a lead mask. He woke up sweaty, his heart racing, feeling as if something had come out of his dream and was there, beside him, just watching. The next morning, Miguel was already waiting for him. With an eager smile, he held up two shiny lead masks in the dim light of the workshop. "We are ready," he said, and for the first time, Manuel felt that there was no going back. The decision to travel to Morro do Vintem was not made in an instant, but rather built on a succession of small, disturbing events. First, there was the letter with no return address, which seemed to whisper a forgotten secret. Then, the presence of that man in sunglasses, who appeared only once but left an uncomfortable feeling that he was still nearby, watching. Miguel himself, normally so rational, was obsessed. "There's something big behind this, Manuel. Something that could change everything." Manuel, on the other hand, was hesitant. Ever since the dream with the lead mask, he had felt a weight in his chest, as if something invisible was squeezing his heart, trying to warn him not to move forward. But every time I looked at Miguel, I saw in his eyes a spark of something I had never seen before, a feverish glow, a hunger for knowledge that burned like an uncontrollable fire. Deep down, he knew there was no choice anymore. They had been drawn into something much bigger than they imagined. The day before the trip, they were both seen in different stores in the city, buying objects that no one could fully understand. Witnesses reported that Manuel and Miguel entered an industrial material store and came out with rolls of lead, a small blowtorch, and a strange metal box. They were later seen purchasing waterproof covers and pharmaceutical capsules from a discreet pharmacy. The pharmacist, suspicious, asked what they were for, but Miguel just smiled and replied, "For a unique experience." The strangest thing was the making of the lead masks. Using the torch and metal plates, they spent hours in the workshop molding those macabre pieces. These were no ordinary masks. They were solid, heavy, and only covered the eyes. Why? What exactly were they trying to protect? With each hammer on the metal, a shiver ran up Manuel's spine. The sound echoed through the workshop like the toll of a funeral bell. That night, a neighbor reported hearing the two talking in low voices. The man, an elderly man, swore he heard something that left him sleepless. What will happen after the light? Will we be able to return? The answer came from Miguel in a serious and inexpressive tone. It doesn't matter. We're ready to cross. Hours later, before dawn, Manuel and Miguel left. They carried only the essentials: the impeccable suits, the capes, the masks, and a note that contained cryptic instructions. 16:30, be in the designated location. 18:30, ingest capsules. After effect to protect metals. Wait for masked signal. The taxi driver who took them to Niterói said that they were both tense, looking back constantly, as if they were afraid they were being followed. But perhaps the worst of all was Manuel's last look before disappearing over the hill. A resident of the region who was passing by said he saw him hesitate, look at Miguel and then at the lead mask he was holding in his hands. And for a brief second, it looked like he wanted to scream. But he didn't scream, just moved on. The road to Niterói was enveloped in a strange silence. The sky, normally blue and vibrant at this time of year, seemed opaque, as if an invisible fog covered the world. In the back seat of the taxi, Manuel watched the streetlights passing one by one, feeling a growing uneasiness in his chest. Miguel, at his side, kept his eyes fixed on the folded note in his hands. He read it over and over again as if each word hid a secret meaning. The driver noticed the strange behavior of the two passengers. They didn't talk, they didn't laugh, they didn't seem excited about a trip. Instead, they constantly looked in the rearview mirror as if expecting someone to follow them. At one point, the driver casually asked if they were going to visit relatives trying to start a conversation. Miguel replied, without looking away from the note, something like that. After that, the silence became absolute. Hours before the trip, Manuel and Miguel made one last stop at a discreet pharmacy, far from the busy streets. A woman working at the counter was the last person to see them before they embarked into the unknown. She later told police that the two seemed nervous, whispering to each other as they looked at the prescription drug shelf. As they approached, Miguel asked about specific capsules, something the woman had never heard of. She refused to sell, explaining that she was not authorized to supply unknown substances. Miguel smiled, as if he had already expected that answer, and pulled a small piece of paper from his pocket. There was a medicine name written on it, something difficult to pronounce. When she read it, she felt an inexplicable chill. "Sorry, but what is this for?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Miguel just tilted his head as if pondering whether he should say it. So, he answered simply, "Expansion." Expansion? Expansion of what? The brain, conscience, the reality? The woman didn't ask anything else. He just watched as the two left the pharmacy, their shadows trailing across the sidewalk in the weak afternoon sun. In the taxi, Manuel pressed the lead mask over his legs. The cold metal seemed to pulse beneath his fingers, as if it had a life of its own. Something inside him screamed at him to give up, to ask the driver to take them back. But he looked at Miguel and realized there was no going back. Destiny awaited them at the top of Morro do Vintém. The clock showed 4:10 p.m. Within 20 minutes, they would be at the designated location. And from then on, there would be no more escape. The phone rang 3 times before being answered. On the other end of the line, Manuel's voice was tense, almost trembling. His sister immediately realized something was wrong. "Are you well?" It seemed strange. There was a pause. She could hear heavy, hesitant breathing. Then Manuel finally responded, his voice reduced to a whisper. "If something happens, just know that it was our choice. Don't look for answers. Don't try to understand. And don't let anyone come after us." The call dropped before she could say anything. The young woman's heart raced. What did he mean by that? Why did he speak as if he were saying goodbye? Tried to call back, but the call didn't go through. Manuel would never answer again. Meanwhile, Miguel made another call, this time to an unknown contact. A witness who was near a phone booth reported, that he spoke in a low tone, as if he was reporting to someone. "We are on the way. The schedule will be followed. The signal will be awaited." The silence that came after was followed by a dry, obedient yes. When Miguel hung up, his face was pale. At the same moment, their families began to feel growing despair. Mothers called friends, relatives, anyone who might have news. But it was already too late. No amount of begging could bring them back. Though, road to Morro do Vintém seemed longer than it should have been. The taxi moved slowly, its tires squeaking over the uneven asphalt. The sky, previously cloudy, now seemed to darken abnormally, as if night came early just for them. That's when it happened. On the side of the road, under a flickering streetlight, a tall man wearing a black suit watched them. He didn't signal for a ride, just was there, standing still, looking directly into the car. Manuel felt his blood run cold in his veins. Miguel beside him murmured something inaudible, almost like a prayer. The driver also noticed and turned back. "Do you know that guy?" Neither of them responded. The mysterious man then raised his right hand as if making an oath, but there was something wrong. His fingers were too long and his skin felt wrong, like melted wax. Manuel looked away for a second. When he looked back, the man was gone. There were no trees, alleys, or anywhere he could have hidden. The taxi drove in absolute silence. They were already being expected. The clock showed 4:29 p.m. It was 1 minute before the meeting point. The taxi stopped at the foot of Morro do Vintém. The driver looked in the rearview mirror, waiting for someone to say something, anything, but all he heard was the click of the door opening. Manuel and Miguel descended without looking back, their shadows lengthened by the setting sun. "Are you sure? There's nothing here," ventured the driver, looking at the dense vegetation that swallowed the path. Miguel gave him a cold and enigmatic look. "Don't worry. What we came to look for is already waiting for us." Without another word, the two began to climb. The wind whistled through the trees, bringing a metallic smell to the air. Manuel felt a shiver run up his spine. Something was wrong there, as if the space around him was slightly out of sync with reality. With each step, the feeling of being watched grew. But there was no one there. When they reached the top, the sun had already disappeared, giving way to a reddish sky, as if it was burning from the inside. Miguel stopped abruptly. Their eyes widened at what they saw. On the floor, around them, there were marks. They were symmetrical circles drawn with frightening precision, as if someone had planned this for a long time. Inside the circles, symbols Manuel didn't recognize flickered in the dim light. There were no footprints around. If anyone was there before them, they didn't come walking. The air became heavy. Manuel tried to say something, but his voice seemed to have been sucked into himself. Miguel, on the other hand, knelt down and took a paper out of his pocket. He already knew what to do. With steady hands, he wrote a note in an almost ritualistic handwriting. The words flowed as if they weren't his own. 1630, be in the designated location. 1830, ingest capsules. After effect to protect metals, wait for masked signal. When he finished, he looked at Manuel and smiled, but it wasn't a smile of tranquility. It was something sick, ecstatic, as if a part of him was no longer there. Now we just need to wait. Time seemed to slow down. The silence was absolute. No insects, no birds, nothing. As if the world was holding its breath. Then, a sound cut through the air. A sharp crack, like something huge moving in the darkness. And it was at that moment that Manuel realized they were never alone. Darkness seemed to pulse around them. The note was written. The lead masks were next to each one, and now all that remained was to complete the last step. Miguel took a small amber glass bottle from his pocket. Inside, 2 white capsules rested. Fragile and harmless at first glance, Manuel hesitated. The weight of the unknown crushed him. Ever since they climbed the hill, something inside him was screaming to stop, to run. But Michael had already made his decision. With a fixed gaze, she opened the bottle and swallowed a capsule without hesitation. "Your time." Miguel's voice sounded distant, as if he were on the other side of a tunnel. Manuel's hands were shaking. The air around them seemed to vibrate as if the world was adjusting to something invisible. He closed his eyes, swallowed hard, and put the capsule in his mouth. The taste was bitter, metallic. Something was wrong. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. The silence remained absolute, heavy as lead. But then, the ground shook. It was no ordinary tremor. It was as if the earth was breathing. The surrounding reality began to deform. The trees bent impossibly, as if they were melting, their trunks twisting at sickening angles. The sky above, once black and starless, now pulsed with shades of red and violet like an open wound. Then came the sounds, noises that did not belong to this world. There were whispers, muffled screams, distant laughter, and something else. Something incomprehensible. Words that shouldn't exist whispered in a language no one had ever spoken. Manuel fell to his knees, pressing his ears. It wasn't just sound. It was something entering inside him. Miguel, on the other hand, raised his head, his eyes wide in ecstasy. "They are here," he murmured. Manuel wanted to ask who, but he couldn't. His body no longer obeyed. His muscles were locked as if invisible wires were holding him in place. Fear took over him. Something was approaching. And then, without warning, the world stopped. Time froze for an instant, impossible to measure. And when he started moving again, Manuel noticed something terrifying. He and Miguel were no longer alone. Time no longer made sense. The air seemed to vibrate in invisible waves, and Manuel felt as if he were being pulled out of himself. The surrounding hill had changed. Or maybe they were the ones who crossed over to somewhere else. Miguel was motionless, his wide eyes staring into space. His face was pale, almost translucent in the spectral light that was beginning to emanate from the ground. The circular markings around them now glowed a sickly purple. And then the visions began. Manuel blinked, and for an instant he found himself in a field of twisted metal, where impossible towers rose into a starless sky. Shapes moved between structures, long, thin shadows that bent in an unnatural way. They had no faces, but he knew they were looking right at him. It blinked again, and now it was sinking in thick black water, something gripping his ankles, dragging him into the depths. Miguel was there too, but not as he knew him. His eyes were gone, and his mouth was sewn shut with lead wire. When Manuel blinked a third time, he returned to the hill. But someone was with them now. It wasn't human. The tall, distorted silhouette rose within the glowing circle, its limbs too elongated for any earthly creature. His face was a pulsing void, a living darkness that sucked in all the light around it. The entity watched them, and Manuel felt his mind breaking into fragments. Miguel opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Just blood. Then, without warning, they started to move, not willingly. Manuel felt his legs lift, his arms stretch, but he didn't control his body. It was as if something inside him was being pulled, ripped out, rewritten. Miguel fell to his knees, his body convulsing. The entity leaned over him, and Manuel saw something impossible. Miguel was falling apart. It wasn't flesh tearing, nor bone breaking. It was his existence being dismantled, like a drawing that someone erases with an eraser. Manuel wanted to scream, but his mouth wouldn't move. The weather froze again, and at that moment, he knew that he no longer belonged to the world. He knew he and Miguel, they had crossed the border. Time was no longer linear. Manuel felt his body dissolving into fragments of consciousness, as if he were scattered between several realities at the same time. He was trying to hold on to something, anything that would keep him tethered to what was left of his sanity. Miguel was on the floor, his eyes wide in a mixture of ecstasy and horror. His mouth moved but made no sound. The purple light that radiated from the symbols around them now pulsed violently, as if it were a monstrous heart, beating into the very fabric of space. And then, the figure appeared. She emerged from the darkness without a single sound. Tall, hooded, faceless. Just a void where there should be human traces. His hands, long and bony, hovered at his sides, slender fingers that seemed to be made of liquid shadow. The simple presence of that thing crushed Manuel with overwhelming terror. It was no ordinary fear. It was an ancestral dread, a primitive instinct that screamed that he was facing something that shouldn't exist. His mind wanted to run away. He wanted to disconnect from it before it was too late, but his body didn't respond. The being leaned slightly towards them, and then he whispered. It wasn't a voice. It was a thought that invaded their minds without permission, a stream of information that should not be understood by a human brain. The revelation came like a bolt of lightning, cutting his sanity in half. What they had done that night was not a ritual to open a portal. They were the portal. The metal, the capsules, the note. Everything had been calculated to transform Manuel and Miguel into living anchors for something much bigger than themselves. The process was incomplete, but enough had already been activated. Manuel felt something inside himself breaking away. As if your soul is being excavated, your memories are fragmenting, your self is being rewritten. Miguel opened his mouth to scream, but was silenced. The entity just watched. It wasn't finished yet, and Manuel understood at that moment that they would never be the same again. Manuel tried to fight the feeling of being sucked into himself, but it was useless. His mind no longer belonged to him. He was falling apart, thought by thought, memory by memory. Beside him, Miguel no longer looked like Miguel. His face trembled. His features deformed as if they were made of melted wax. His eyes blinked strangely, blinking too quickly, like a distorted movie playing at the wrong speed. The hooded being still watched them, motionless, as if analyzing an unfinished work of art. Something was happening inside them, something that shouldn't be there. Manuel tried to scream, but his voice came out in distant echoes, reverberating in different directions, as if he were speaking in several realities at the same time. He was in multiple places, could feel his own presence outside one's own body, observing oneself from an impossible angle. Miguel fell back, twitching. His limbs creaked. His fingers lengthened and shortened in a grotesque cycle of deformation. It was being rebuilt. But not in the right way. It was then that the entity raised its hand, and everything tore in half. The reality around them opened like an exposed wound, and Manuel saw through the tear. What was on the other side could not be described. It wasn't space, it wasn't darkness. It was an infinity of eyes, mouths, and twisted limbs, a chaos of shapes that should not coexist. And then he understood. The ritual, it was complete. But something had gone wrong. Manuel and Miguel hadn't just served as portals. They had become part of it. Their bodies were still there, their minds still existed in some form, but it wasn't just them anymore. Miguel tried to say something, but his mouth was now split in two, his words coming out as overlapping whispers. They no longer belonged to this world. The hooded figure slowly turned around, as if hearing something beyond human comprehension. There was an error in the equation, and then Manuel felt the crushing weight of what had happened. They should never have tried. They should never have taken the capsules. They should never have come to Morro do Vintém. But now it was too late, because the ritual could never be undone. Manuel felt his body collapse. He heard a dull impact, but the pain never came. He was lying motionless, eyes wide open at the dark sky of Morro do Vintém. The world still spun in distorted spirals around him, but now something felt empty, as if something inside him had been ripped away. Beside him, Miguel was also lying down. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if he was just sleeping. But Manuel knew that it was not the same Miguel who had climbed that hill with him. Above them, the hooded figure disappeared. His silhouette began to dissolve like smoke being sucked into a vacuum, until there was nothing left. No sound, no sign of his presence, as if it had never been there, but Manuel knew this was a lie. Something remained, something inside them. He tried to move his fingers, but he couldn't. He tried to blink, but his eyes remained open, stuck in that position. He no longer had control over his body. Only his thoughts wandered, and those were the worst part. What had they allowed in? The images he saw at the moment of the tear were actually still there, imprinted in his mind like marks burned into raw flesh. The eyes within the darkness, the mouths whispering secrets he should never have heard, the shapes twisting at impossible angles. They weren't just looking at him, they were waiting. Miguel's breathing started to slow down. Very slow. Time seemed to drag by. How many minutes had passed? Or was it hours? Days? Then a thought crossed Manuel's mind. A final revelation that made terror tear at what was left of his sanity. What if they never woke up again? What if? Was this the end, or worse? What if something new awakened in their bodies, taking their forms back to the world, but without their souls inside? The surrounding darkness grew deeper, and then came absolute silence. The smell of the humid forest and the absolute silence of Morro do Vintém were only broken 2 days later, when a group of boys who were looking for a lost kite found the bodies. They were there, lying side by side, motionless, as if they were just sleeping. Their eyes were covered by lead masks. Their suits were impeccable. Their waterproof capes were folded over their bodies like a meticulously calculated ritual. Not a drop of blood, no signs of a struggle. Nothing. The boys ran down the hill, shouting to whoever was nearby. Before long, the police arrived at the scene, and that's when the mystery began. Investigators examined the bodies with bewilderment. There were no visible injuries, no signs of apparent poisoning, no bruises to indicate violence. The clothes were clean, without traces of dirt or excessive sweat, as if the two had simply laid there and died. But the most disturbing detail was Manuel and Miguel's expressions. Even covered by lead masks, it was possible to see that their mouths were slightly open, as if they were trying to say something before the end, and his fingers were slightly curved, as if they were still holding something that was no longer there. Around, the police found few belongings: an empty water bottle, a notebook with cryptic notes, a disturbing note. Set 30, be in the designated location. 1830. Just capsules. After effect to protect metals, wait for masked signal. None of these clues made sense. What did they expect? What masked signal was this? Forensic examinations revealed something even stranger. There were no toxic substances in their bodies, no poison, no drugs, nothing that would justify death. It was like had simply ceased to exist. The police tried to reconstruct their steps. Until that fateful night, they discovered that Manuel and Miguel had made strange purchases, acted nervously, and talked about things that no one understood. But none of this information explained how or why they died. The case quickly began to attract press attention. Theories began to emerge: ritualistic suicide, scientific experiment gone wrong, extraterrestrial contact, involvement with some secret sect. But deep down, the truth was more terrifying than any theory, because that same night, as the bodies were taken from the hill, someone or something was still up there watching and waiting for the next call. The research room was plunged into an uncomfortable silence. The detectives on the case, sitting around the table, observed the note found next to the bodies of Manuel and Miguel. The words, although written clearly, they didn't make any sense. Be in the designated location. 1830, ingest capsules. After effect to protect metals, wait for masked signal. What the hell does that mean? Muttered one of the investigators, running his hands through his hair. The note suggested a detailed plan, but for what? If it was a suicide, why the lead masks? Why capsules? And why was there no poison in their bodies? The police looked for any foreign substances on the corpses. Toxicological tests were exhaustive. They analyzed blood, tissues, internal organs. Nothing. No traces of poison, drugs, or psychoactive substances. Nothing that could explain death. This doesn't make sense. said the coroner, closing the report. They died, but there is no biological reason for it. With each new attempt to solve the case, more questions arose. Investigators retraced the victims' steps. They discovered that they had purchased strange materials: the lead masks, the blowtorch, the unidentified pharmaceutical capsules. They were seen walking around the city restlessly, looking over their shoulders, as if they were sure they were being followed. The owner of the pharmacy where they bought the capsules was questioned several times, but his answer was always the same. They asked for something I had never heard of. And when I asked why, they only told me, for a unique experience. The victims' families were interviewed. They reported that Manuel and Miguel had been different the last few days, more silent, absorbed in thought, making enigmatic calls, and demonstrating a growing obsession with something they never revealed. The case began to gain notoriety in the newspapers. Sensationalist headlines appeared on the news. The mystery of the lead masks, deadly experiment or extraterrestrial. Contact? Men die in secret ritual. Police find no explanation. But despite public pressure, the investigation was not progressing. There were no suspects. There was no cause of death. There was no evidence of foul play. It was an unsolved enigma. And in essence, researchers began to wonder if they really wanted to find the truth, because sometimes there are secrets that shouldn't be discovered, and they felt that this case was one of them. Journalist Vicente Mora did not believe in coincidences. He had been following mysterious crimes for years and knew how to recognize a case when something didn't fit. The so-called lead mask mystery wasn't just an unsolved case. He was something that no one seemed to want to resolve. The police shelved the investigation too quickly. No concrete line was followed. No reasonable explanation was presented. But Vicente knew there was more there. Much more. He began interviewing residents of the Morro do Vintem region. Some answers were vague, others contradictory. But then, a witness finally revealed something that chilled his blood. "I saw the lights." Vicente frowned. "Lights? What kind of lights?" The man, an elderly resident who avoided talking about the case, hesitated before continuing. "That night, there was something in the sky. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't lightning, it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before." "What exactly did you see?" The man swallowed hard. "They were spheres, too. They floated over the hill, motionless, glowing orange, like fire suspended in the air. But then, they just disappeared." Vicente felt a shiver run down his spine. This was never mentioned in the newspapers. By crossing information, he discovered that other people had also reported strange phenomena that night. A woman who lived on the slope of the hill said that her radio started to squeak by itself at exactly 6:30 p.m., the same time indicated on the Note of the Dead. A boy playing outside the house said he saw shadows moving alone close to the trail. A police officer, who requested anonymity, confessed that his team found it strange that the vegetation around the bodies was untouched, as if no one had actually climbed there. But what disturbed Vicente most was a specific report. A mysterious man was seen in the region on the night of Manuel and Miguel's death. Tall, wearing a black suit, standing on the side of the road watching. When someone tried to get closer, he disappeared. Vicente felt his stomach turn. Something inside him told him he was getting too close to the truth, and maybe that was a mistake. Vicente Mora typed frantically on his typewriter, the keys clicking in the silent dawn. He was close, too close. Each new clue led to a dead end, but that only confirmed his suspicion. Someone was covering up the truth. That morning, he had received an anonymous phone call. The voice was hoarse, low, almost a whisper. "Stop. You don't want to know what really happened that night." Vicente felt a chill. "Who are you?" The call dropped. A few hours later, he went to the police station to try to access the official reports on Manuel and Miguel's case. But to his surprise, the documents had disappeared. "This is impossible," said one of the archive employees. "They were handed over weeks ago to a government agent. We don't know where they are now." Vicente felt adrenaline course through his body. The government was involved, but why? The coroner who examined the bodies had also disappeared from the city. The pharmacist who sold the capsules to Manuel and Miguel refused to speak with anyone. A witness who claimed to have seen strange men near the hill died in a mysterious accident. All of this could only mean one thing. They were hiding something big. That night, while returning home, Vicente noticed that he was being followed. A black car, its headlights off, remained at the same speed as him through several streets. He made random turns, went into alleys, but the car never let him out of its sight. The journalist felt a lump in his throat. If he continued with this investigation, he could be the next one to disappear. He got home in a hurry, locked the door, and ran to the phone. I needed to tell someone everything before it was too late. But when he picked up the device, he realized that the line was dead. They were already there. Somebody I didn't want the truth to be discovered. And Vicente realized too late that maybe he should never have started this investigation. Vicente Mora hadn't slept in days. Since he started investigating the lead masks case, the world around him felt wrong. The nightmares first started with the victims' families. Manuel's sister said that in the last few nights, I always woke up at 6:30 p.m. sharp, feeling as if someone was standing next to her bed, watching her in the dark. Miguel's mother claimed to have dreamed about her son, but he had had no eyes, and its mouth was sewn together with metallic threads. Vicente tried to ignore the reports, but then the nightmares came to him. On the first night, he dreamed that he was at the top of Morro do Vintém. The wind was blowing hard, and the fog around him was so thick that he could barely see, but he knew he wasn't alone. There was something there, standing among the trees, faceless, without a defined shape, waiting. He woke up panting, sweaty, the clock showing exactly 6:30 p.m., but the worst was yet to come. That afternoon, when he returned home, he found a small package left on his doorstep. No sender, no markings, just a cassette tape inside. He hesitated before putting it into the recorder. The tape hiss seemed endless, as if something was being muffled. But then, the voices began. Two voices, Manuel and Miguel. They spoke quietly as if they were afraid someone would hear them. The recording appeared to have been made shortly before they climbed the hill. "What do you think will happen?" asked a voice that Vicente recognized as Manuel's. "The crossing," replied Miguel. "They will call us, the signal will come." There was silence. Vicente felt his body tense. The tape hiss grew louder, distorted, as if something was interfering with the recording. And then, amidst the noise, a whisper was heard. Low, dragged, saying a name. Vicente. The journalist froze. The tape was talking to him. His trembling fingers turned off the recorder. His heart hammered in his chest. That wasn't possible, but he knew, deep in his soul, that now it was too late to turn back. Why, that which killed Manuel and Miguel. Now I knew it existed, and it was coming after him. Vicente Mora was losing track of reality. The voice on the cassette tape calling him by name was the breaking point. He tried to find rational explanations, tried to convince himself that he was paranoid, but the truth was much worse. He had become part of the mystery. Still, he needed to continue. I needed to understand what Manuel and Miguel did that night. His searches led him to a retired physics professor, a reclusive man who avoided talking about the case. Vicente pressured him, insisted, until he finally gave in. The old academic wiped his glasses, sighed deeply, and revealed something that had never been publicized. The ritual failed. Vicente frowned. Ritual? Do you mean a scientific experiment? An experiment? The teacher shook his head. No, this was a calling. A call to something that should never be answered. Vicente felt his stomach turn. But if it failed, then why did Manuel and Miguel die? The teacher looked at him, and Vicente knew that I wouldn't like the answer. Because the ritual didn't completely fail. The journalist felt a chill down his spine. What do you mean by that? The teacher hesitated before continuing. The process was stopped before it was complete. Something came to them, but it wasn't fully anchored in this world. Vicente remained silent, processing those words. Something came to them, something unfinished. Something that now wandered without form, without body, waiting. The teacher continued. That's why no one can explain how they died. Their bodies may have stayed here, but something inside them was taken. Vicente felt a shiver run down the back of his neck. What did they take? The old professor stared at him fixedly. The right question would be, what was left behind? The silence that followed was unbearable. Vicente realized that the ritual was not finished, and the thing that Manuel and Miguel invoked, it was still there, lurking, waiting. Another sacrifice. He felt his skin crawl, because deep down he knew the next one could be him. Vicente Mora was not the only one obsessed with the mystery of the lead masks. Others had also fallen into the trap of the unknown. The journalist received an anonymous email with a link to an obscure internet forum. The topic was called, "The Ritual Never Ended." He read in silence, his eyes running over each word with growing discomfort. Users discussed theories about the case, from the possibility of a communication experiment with interdimensional beings to the participation of a secret sect. But one specific comment made his blood run cold. Someone tried to redo the ritual, and it disappeared. Vicente clicked on the attached link and found news buried in a conspiracist blog. Man found dead under mysterious circumstances in the Niterói region. His name was Rodrigo Alves, a young electrical engineering student. According to acquaintances, he was obsessed with Manuel and Miguel's case, searching everything he could find. Rodrigo disappeared after sending a cryptic message to a friend. "I'm going to the hill tonight. I need to see for myself. If something goes wrong, remember the masks." 2 days later, he was found dead, and the details were terrifying. His body was lying in the same position as those of Manuel and Miguel. He was wearing a suit and raincoat. Next to him was a lead mask, incomplete, as if he hadn't had time to finish it. The toxicological exam? Again, nothing. No poison, no suspicious substances. Vicente felt a weight in his chest. The thing that expected a new sacrifice had achieved it. The police quickly silenced the case. No press conference, no clarification. It was as if they wanted no one to know, but it was too late. The story leaked onto the internet and theories exploded. Was it a ritualistic suicide? Was Rodrigo the victim of an invisible force? Was the entity that Manuel and Miguel summoned still active? Discussions took an even darker turn when rumors began to surface about secret cults that could be linked to the mystery. People claimed that Manuel and Miguel, they weren't the first to try, and they wouldn't be the last. Vicente knew this was no longer just a cold case. It was a living curse, and now anyone who dared delve too deeply into it was marked. Vicente Mora was no longer the same. Since he started digging too deep into the mystery of the lead masks, his life had become a constant nightmare. He slept little, and when he managed to close his eyes, the dreams were always the same. He was at the top of Morro do Vintem. The wind blew cold, carrying a distant sound, like voices whispering something he didn't understand. The surrounding trees bent in impossible ways, as if they were trying to escape. In the middle of the circle engraved on the floor, Manuel and Miguel were kneeling, holding the lead masks. But they were still alive. In the dream, Vicente saw everything from the point of view of something that was watching them. Something that was there with them that night. The two muttered meaningless words, shaking in fear. The surrounding air vibrated. Then the world ripped in half and a presence emerged from the void. At the moment when Vicente tried to see the creature's face, he would wake up suddenly, sweaty, with the feeling that someone was in his room. On the third night following the same dream, he realized this wasn't just a nightmare, it was a warning. And then he began to notice that I was no longer alone. A black car parked on the corner of your street for hours, always with tinted windows. footsteps behind him at night. But there was never anyone when he looked back. Your phone ringing in the middle of the night, but when you answer, all I heard was static. Vicente no longer knew whether he was paranoid or someone really wanted to silence him. It was then that he received the envelope. It was left on the doorstep of his apartment, with no return address. Inside was paper yellowed, with age. Another note similar to the one found with Manuel and Miguel, but this was never disclosed by the police, and it contained just a single sentence. We were never alone. Vicente's heart raced. What did this mean? Who sent it? He looked around, feeling a chill take over his body. Outside, on the deserted street, the black car was no longer there, but he knew that someone was still watching him, and that his time was running out. Vicente Mora knew he could no longer run away. The truth was close, but he wasn't sure he wanted to know it. With the second note in hand, he searched his contacts, trying to find someone who could clarify what really happened in Morro de Vintem. It was then that he found a name buried in the archives of an old scientific publication. Dr. Alvaro Ramirez, a former government researcher, abruptly removed from his duties in 1967, just a year after the deaths of Manuel and Miguel. Vicente managed to locate him in an isolated place in the interior. The man was already elderly, but when he heard the name Lead Masks, his face lost all color. You found the second note, didn't you? Vicente hesitated before responding. What does this mean? We were never alone. Alone where? The old teacher sighed and then told the truth. The case of Manuel and Miguel. It wasn't the first. In 1953, in Russia, 2 men were found dead under the same circumstances, wearing suits with strange metal masks and an incomprehensible note. In 1939, in France, another similar case. An engineer was found dead on a hill, holding a lead mask and with no apparent cause of death. Reports indicated that these events had been occurring for more than a century, always with the same pattern in different parts of the world. What were they trying to do? Vicente asked, feeling a terrible weight in his chest. The teacher looked at him with tired eyes. They were trying to open a channel of communication, but not with something extraterrestrial, but with something that was already here. Vicente felt his throat dry up. What? The old man took a deep breath and whispered, something that has always been here, something he has always observed, something to wait. On the night that Manuel and Miguel performed the ritual, they didn't just contact this entity, they released it. But as the ritual failed, it was incomplete, trapped between the worlds. Since then, she was on the loose. Vicente swallowed. And where? Where is it now? The teacher looked at him sadly. You already know the answer. It was then that Vicente felt something behind him. The air grew cold. The shadow in the room seemed to lengthen, and for the first time, he knew he was no longer alone. On the morning of September 3rd, the newspaper's editor, The Hidden Truth, Vicente Mora's absence was strange. The journalist never failed to deliver his stories. He tried calling Vicente's landline, but no one answered. Sent messages. Nothing. So, he decided to go to his apartment. When he arrived, the door was unlocked. Vicente's small office was messy, as if he had left in a hurry. But what really made the editor feel a knot in his stomach was what was on the table. A single sheet of paper. No matter. No text. Just 3 words written in the center of the page. Wait, masked signal. The case of the disappearance of Vicente Mora was never resolved. Your computer has been found completely erased, as if someone had deleted all the files manually. No neighbors heard anything strange the night before. The black car that followed him was never seen again. It was as if he had never existed. The article he promised to publish never came to light. The mystery of the lead masks has once again been swallowed into oblivion, or at least until the next sacrifice. Because 5 years later, in 1971, a new case emerged. On the other side of the world, in a small town in the interior of Germany, 2 men were found dead, lying side by side, wearing suits with lead masks, and a cryptic note next to them. The local police hushed up the case, no newspaper reported it. But there was a crucial difference. This time, the bodies disappeared from the morgue before the autopsy. And all that was left in the cold room was a single note, identical to the one Vicente received before he disappeared. We were never alone. The horror never ended, and it will never end. Why the ritual continues, waiting, calling, choosing your next victim.